Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some scale choices for the Vamp section of Bolivia, this kind of G7 Vamp, which comes back again and again. Now, if you see a G7 chord symbol as an improviser, you know straight away that means a dominant seventh, i.e. the seventh degree is flattened. And as jazz musicians, our eyes light up when we see a dominant chord because there are so many options available to us. They're almost limitless. But perhaps our first port of call, our kind of primary scale choice, would be what we call the Mixolydian. Now, I'm not going to get too far into explanation of mode, that's a different tutorial, but suffice it to say that the Mixolydian mode is the fifth mode of the major scale. So if you're in the key of C, the Mixolydian would be the mode that starts on G. Play all the notes of C major only starting on G, which of course is the case of Bolivia because it's a G7. So our Mixolydian mode is all the notes of C major but starting on G. And what that gives us is the flattened seventh, the dominant seventh at the top, the F natural. If I play the scale up and down, it sounds like this. Okay, now if you play that scale over the Vamp section of Bolivia, you will sound more than convincing. You can create a very meaningful solo using that essential Mixolydian chord scale, particularly if you highlight the chord tones within it, which are the root, the G, the third, the B, the fifth, the D, and the seventh. Remember, it's a flattened seventh in this case because it's a dominant chord, which is the F natural. Concert pitch, of course. So that's your kind of primary kind of port of call is the Mixolydian mode. What you can do, you can alter that Mixolydian mode very slightly by just adding in a little bit of chromaticism here and there. Now this is sometimes referred to as the bebop scale or the bebop scales. There are several of them, but really all that is just adding some chromaticism into the essential Mixolydian mode. And perhaps the kind of most prevailing one is where you add a little chromatic passing note between the root at the top of the scale and the flattened seventh. So you're essentially putting the natural, the major seventh in there as well, the F sharp concert pitch. So you get this sound. Particularly effective in descent. That was the same thing but starting on the third and coming down. Starting on the fifth, I'm going up the chord tones, then finally starting on the dominant seventh, the flattened seventh itself, the F natural. Okay, so you can start to hear straight away by adding that simple little bit of chromaticism there. You're starting to sound more like a bebop musician. So the next thing you can do is you can employ a process that we call enclosure. Okay, I'm talking through these in stages, different levels. Okay, so if I've lost you by this point, just stick to your Mixolydian mode. That's absolutely fine. But I'm gradually introducing more areas of complexity. And the next one would be this notion of enclosure, which is where you take each of the chord tones, the root, the third, the fifth, and the dominant seventh, the flattened seventh, and you enclose them with the pitches that are either side of it. Now those pitches can be diatonic or within the mode, within the tonal centre, the key centre of your G7 Mixolydian, or they can be what we call chromatic enclosure, which is where you take a note that's a semitone either side of the chord tone and eventually resolve to the chord tone itself. So if I do that with the tonic, I enclose the G by starting on the G sharp above it, going down to the F sharp, and then finally resolving to the G itself, we get this sound. And I can do the same thing with the third, the B. Same thing with the fifth, the D. And finally with the flattened seventh. And if you employ that technique and follow it up with some bebop scale language around it, Mixolydian with chromaticism, you can get this kind of sound. That was enclosing the tonic, enclosing the third, enclosing the fifth, and enclosing the seventh. And if you combine all three of them, you can come up with some really interesting and very stylistically appropriate lines if you're thinking about that kind of bebop tradition. So that was basically just coming down that bebop scale, the Mixolydian mode with a few chromatic alterations, and enclosing each of the chord tones on the way down. The third process, the third level, let's say, is to introduce this idea of implying the two chord within that Mixolydian mode as well. Now, many of you will have heard this term, the 2-5-1 progression, which is perhaps the most kind of prevailing cadential progression in modern jazz or in jazz standards, which is where you have the 2 chord in the key that you're in. So say you're in the key of C major, you would have a D minor 7 would be your 2 chord, moving to the 5 chord, which would be G7, which is what we're working with right now, and then finally resolving to the 1 chord, the C chord itself. Okay, so if G7 is our 5 chord, the 2 chord would be D minor 7 if we were in this kind of key of C that we're thinking. So if you play D minor language within the context of the G7 chord, it will sound very effective because the relationship between the 2 chord and the 5 chord is so well established. And vice versa, if you play dominant language over a 2 minor chord, like kind of in a more of a Dorian context, that will be equally effective as well. So if I start putting in some kind of D minor shapes into my line as well, and then surround that with more bebop language and some enclosures, that sort of thing, again, I'm getting even closer to that kind of traditional bebop sound. So if I simply take that D minor 7, the chord tones, or the arpeggio of that, D, F, A, and C, and run up that arpeggio, and then come down the bebop scale, I get this kind of sound. Or I could start on the 3rd of the 2 minor, so on the F natural, up to the 5th, up to the 7th, and then up to the 9, the E natural, and then come down the bebop scale. I get this sort of sound. I put a bit of cheeky enclosure in there on the way down as well. Now that's a really good device because it kind of implies that there's got a kind of implicit harmony that's kind of there anyway, this relationship between the 2 chord and the 5 chord. But it's also a really good way of getting up the horn, if you're playing a horn, whatever instrument you're playing, of rapidly ascending into the upper register of the instrument so that you can then add some more language on the descent in a more kind of scalic way. Okay, so that's all that is some inversions of that D minor 7 shape with the bebop or Mixolydian material around it. So any of those devices is really, really useful on this tune Bolivia for that Vamp section. Either the Mixolydian mode in its purest form, adding in some chromaticism to get this kind of bebop scale sound, then adding the enclosure where you chromatically surround the chord tones, and finally kind of implying the 2 minor language within your dominant 7th chord.